Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Alana, and it's my pleasure in just a moment to introduce our speaker. But before I do, I need to ask for a favor. I need at least two people to write me at alana@dralnet.com saying that you would be willing to be a 30-minute interview with some University of Michigan's master's students. They have come to us. We are their class project as they try to sort out what it's like for a master's or a doctoral student at at some university to suddenly find that there's all these supports on the web, how you use it, etc. So please, if you have a half an hour, and especially if you're going to start asking people to do interviews, consider this paying it forward and also getting some experience to see what it's like to be on the other side of one of these interviews. You'll learn some ideas. So let me know. Welcome to see lots of people in the room. And as I switch out the slides, let me just once again be warm and welcoming to Dr. Stephanie Galindo, who's here for the second time today. She's joining us slowly but surely in our team, and any of you who are doing the scavenger hunt. So if you haven't finished your scavenger hunt at PD Education, a half an hour with this woman is the top prize. So she is happy to talk about either what she talked about this time or editing or what she's going to talk about tonight. And with that, I will switch out her slides and turn it over. She says it's a very busy evening, so be prepared to listen up. And I am going to turn myself off, Stephanie, and turn it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo.
That's probably me. Let's see if I can turn myself off fast enough. There we
go. Okay, there it goes. Yes, that was it. Thank you. Thank you, Alana. So this webinar is on interview design, recruiting, and pilot tests. It's about qualitative social research with adult populations. There is a lot more information than I can possibly cover in a 1-hour webinar. So I've put a lot of information in the handout. This includes what I'm talking about, plus some things that I won't be able to talk about at this time. For example, I will put up a couple of slides and I'll let you know when, and the information on the slide is in the handouts, but I won't be able to discuss it in as much detail as I'd like to. I won't be able to take many questions during this webinar. At about the halfway point, I will see where we're at and then look to see if there are some questions, but I may have to save most of them until the end. So let's get started. First of all, what is covered? I am covering a timeline for completion, upfront decisions you'll need to make before you begin, research models and why to use them, bias, interview structure, types of questions and answers sought, recruiting and qualifying participants. And the difference between an interview guide and a questionnaire design is that a questionnaire usually includes closed-ended questions, and an interview is more flexible. But I am going to focus mostly on mixed methods and just use the term interview guide most of the time to describe the instrument. And then we'll talk about approval and pilot tests at the end. Okay. So this is what is not included. If you have questions, I won't be able to answer them regarding sampling. I'm assuming you already have an idea who your sample population will be. Coding, software, engaging minors is not covered. Interview strategies, tips, and skills are something you should probably look up. And when you're getting ready to start, I won't be able to cover that here. Group interviews and data analysis are briefly discussed, but we won't go into detail about group interviews other than a general overview of what they are. So the first section is upfront decisions that you'll need to make when designing your interview. You may adjust your approach as the project evolves, but 5 decisions are essential before you begin. And I made a little mistake on your slide because the 5 decisions are models that you might use: timeline, contact method, data collection method, and analysis method. And then we'll talk about interview strategy. So this is my textbook, my favorite textbook. I can get that in the camera. Social Research Methods by, where's my hand? Alan Bryman and Oxford University Press, 5th edition. This is what I've used for a lot of the information. And when I was doing my dissertation, I used an earlier version of this book. So let's see, if you have questions, you can email me, stephanie@pd.education, and those emails will be forwarded to me as well if you want a little bit more discussion. So let's see, slide number 2. So your first decision is regarding models. Now, part of your literature review, you should have looked in the ProQuest dissertation and thesis database to identify studies conducted by other students on your subject. And your university should give you access to that. Normally, I think, in the US for sure, but I'm pretty sure it's worldwide. So when you're looking at the other students' work, you'll see how they did just about everything in their project. You might find a good model for designing your own study that way. You don't have to, but it's a good idea to take a look, and especially because you can see how they justify their decisions regarding sample size, data collection, how they wrote about data security and confidentiality, how they justified choosing an interview approach, and the reasons they gave for discarding other approaches, because you have to justify all of your choices as you design your interview. And you can cite those studies as a rationale for your choices. And the purpose for doing this is to remember that this is a student project, so make it easy on yourself. You don't need to reinvent everything. You can copy some of what someone else has used as a justification as long as you cite their work. Let's see here. Get this to switch over. So your second decision is regarding the timeline. For when, based on your next due date, I would assume, you reverse engineer your timeline to get clear milestones. You also, that way you can target your deadlines and you have a realistic approach to the task ahead. And so in this timeline, I've included it in handout number 1, which is part of the 24 pages. They're still listed as handout number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can estimate how long each phase of your project will take. This example takes 6 to 7 months. But you might be able to do it faster if you have fewer interviews or a quick APA editor, and if you get a quick turnaround at each point in the approval process. So I'll let you design your timeline and your target dates on your own. The next decision number 3 is how you're going to reach out and contact your participants. You can call random or a purposeful sample, and even use random computer-aided dialing for a price, of course. Cell phones may have issues with connectivity, but younger populations may be more likely to have a cell phone than a landline. You can recruit by email. You can recruit in person, which has distinct advantages for certain kinds of research, but it can take longer and there can be more potential for bias, which we'll talk about later. So you have to think about which method gives you the best access to your targeted population and which method you have access to as well. Random computer-aided dialing is a cost, for example. Recruiting in person has a time cost for you. And don't forget, you need to justify which way you've chosen, or multiple ways, and why you discarded the other options. And you have to discuss what possible bias might arise from using any particular contact method. So handout number 1 details the advantages and justifications for each type of contact, including there are 2 charts showing the comparative strengths and issues with each type of contact. And again, this is taken from the Bryman book on social research methods. And I've added a few comments. So decision number 4 is how you will collect data. You can record conversations on your computer or with a desktop recorder and transcribe later. You can take verbatim notes if you type 100 words a minute, which actually I do and I did, but that is not the best way for everybody. I see a question here. Can you share the slides in a handout? Yes, those will be shared, definitely. Katie and Cappy are computer-aided interview software. Katie is computer-aided telephone interview, and Cappy is for personal interviews. That's where you have your questionnaire or your interview guide already set up online, and you can enter the data, or participants can enter the data online, and you just guide them. Or you can use a paper questionnaire to be returned by post, or you can create a PDF form that they can fill in on their computer. A questionnaire like this assures accuracy, but limits your flexibility, and it's really a questionnaire is not the same thing as an interview. So a critical question is whether you have the access to the software necessary for some of these options. I'm not going to go into detail on software, but another critical note is to describe how you will ensure data confidentiality. So data confidentiality confidential data has to be stored in a physical location, protected from security threats for several years. Either your university thesis manual or other studies that you've seen will provide guidelines. I don't honestly remember where I found the actual time frame that I was supposed to store this information, but I believe it was 3 to 5 years. And you must describe in your paper how you will provide security for the data before, during, and after the interviews. You must also protect participant identities. One strategy is to protect identity by asking your participants to suggest a pseudonym prior to participating in your study. So when they sign their informed consent form, they will give you a pseudonym that you can use when you write about their responses. That's kind of fun for them. Or you can just give them participant numbers. You know, participant number 1 said this and participant number 2 said that. So we'll also talk more about that a little bit later. So let's see. The 5th decision is regarding your analysis. I see a question about IRB. If the interviews we have done will be released to the public, posted online, do we still need IRB approval? As far as I understand, and I was going to mention this a little later, you always need IRB approval. The IRB either has to sign off. An IRB is an institutional review board or an ethical review board or ethical review committee that will make a decision as to whether you need oversight in working with your population. Even if your interviewees have signed a consent form for being interviewed, yes, they usually, I would imagine most schools, my school definitely still required that we get approval from the institutional review board. Although you can ask, in our form, you could ask for exempt status, and it passed through very quickly. It wasn't a big deal because we're working with adult populations. We're not conducting experiments on them, and we're not discussing really invasive, or I wasn't at least discussing really invasive information. So it really, they have to make this decision for you. Data analysis. Before you design your interview, you have to consider how you'll analyze your data, because this influences the entire process. Interviews may include qualitative and quantitative questions, mixed method, but graphs look really nice in a presentation. So you can generate statistics without using software. For example, you can calculate the percentage of respondents that said yes or no to a question. And on a 5-point Likert scale, you can calculate how many respondents agreed or disagreed or any variation in between or liked or disliked a topic. You can quantify demographic information. Those are all closed-ended questions, and they lend themselves easily to statistical analysis that you can show in a graph, which looks nice in your presentation. So statistical models for analyzing the data that you collect during your interview can be generated with SPSS software to illustrate patterns in participant responses, but you have to decide up front, are you going to have access to this software? Do you have the knowledge to run the software? Or do you need help even interpreting the models that the software generates? If you want to use coding to analyze qualitative remarks, there's software you can use, QSR and Vivo. I don't know anything about it. I've never used it, and I didn't use coding, but it is an option, and you'll see it in your social research method books, textbooks, and you should look into that because it might be a great option for you. Do you want to ask participants for qualifying remarks to obtain greater insights following closed-ended questions? This is a decision you might want to make up front too, because then you can have your Likert scales or your yes/no questions, and then a few sub-questions under that that you can probe for more information. Can you design your questions in groups or themes, creating different sections in the interview guide? This might be helpful for when you do your analysis later, is to have things grouped up front, the questions grouped up front. During analysis, you can group responses into thematic narratives when you're describing the different responses coalesced in your analysis. Statistical models can generate thematic patterns too. So decide up front how you're going to approach your analysis. And handout number 2 has additional details in this regard. So I mentioned mixed methods. Mixed method research uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative questions in the interview guide. There are a number of closed-ended questions that can generate quantitative information, as I was saying. One type, the 5-point Likert scales, you have to make sure that it has an equal number of options on each side of the response. The neutral response is central, and you have to have an equal number of negative or fairly negative options on one side and positive or fairly positive options on the other side. For example, if you ask, would you say that your organization's culture is inclusive? And then they say, oh yes, I agree or disagree. Then you can probe further. This is what I meant by the sub-questions. How do you define your organization? How do you define organizational culture? Why do you think your organization's culture is inclusive? And this gives you a vast amount of additional information to analyze later. And then you can see if they were talking about the same thing, if each of your participants thought about culture the same way or not. And that's why they may have thought it was inclusive or not. So it gives you a lot to speak about. Not only does this strategy provide percentages that you can show on a chart, but you can develop these much more in-depth analysis of participant perspectives and develop content-based descriptive themes from the sub-questions. So again, handout number 2 has some more details on this. So the next section, we'll talk about bias and structure. And you're welcome, Rencharo. Let's see. Come on. Okay, potential for bias. This is really important, and actually you will talk about this a lot in your paper. You must discuss the potential for bias in your paper. Initially, you must justify your choices in designing the interview. Then you describe step by step what occurred as you conducted your research from the recruiting process all the way through the interviews. The premise is that others may want to replicate your process to validate your results. So you have to describe your process step by step in detail. If something happens during the interview, you don't consider it good or bad, it just is what it is. But you must describe what happened and how it may have influenced or biased the results. So I've listed just a few types of bias here on this slide. These should be preventable. But there are many other types of bias, like respondent bias, social desirability bias, habituation, confirmation bias, culture bias, and there are many others. So it's mandatory to discuss each of these in your paper to make sure that you minimize the possibility of bias and admit it when there is a chance of bias occurring. So look each of those up and see handout number 3 for a more comprehensive list. So no research is entirely free of bias, so you will you should expect to have some that you'll talk about. You must precisely describe how you try to avoid bias, and you do so by using specific strategies. And you want to use as many strategies as you can, and plan in advance where you can, and then revisit that after the fact, and you say, oh yeah, I actually used this strategy, and write about it. So look these strategies up in your textbook again. Briefly, you justify your sample size and qualifying criteria. Purposeful sampling with individuals having prolonged engagement in the subject of study provides credibility through expertise, for example. Persistent observation is when you engage with participants longer. This facilitates clarity and insight regarding their experiences, perspectives, or motivations. It's asking those sub-questions helps in this context. Inter-rater reliability is really provided through reviews by a supervisor or your committee, so you'll get that one. Negative case analysis is when you discuss how researcher expectations, such as a hypothesis, were contradicted. And it's very important to demonstrate throughout your study any conflicting evidence or lines of thoughts, whether the conflict was with your assumptions or between other researchers, because this shows that you looked at all sides of the equation or the problem. So evaluate your approach by discussing all these different ways of proving your research is credible. And really, you do want to discuss absolutely all of them if you can. Handout number 3 has more definitions, and I've included a lengthy example of how to discuss bias in your paper, taken from my own paper, and it's a couple pages long, so you really do get into this. And also look at how other students discuss bias in their published papers in ProQuest. You may want to cite their papers. That's how I figured out what to write. Structure. So the interview structure overall can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. We're going to focus on semi-structured, but I'm going to go ahead and give you an overview of the different styles. Think about whether you want specifics, or if you're interested in having the opportunity to explore, maybe ask impromptu questions or probe deeper during the interview process, or perhaps a little of each. What strategy might work best to answer your research questions? That's the critical question to ask yourself. So now let's define these strategies. Okay, structured interviews, as I mentioned before, like a questionnaire, is a standardized instrument like a survey or poll. It provides a uniform set of questions to each respondent and lends itself to quantitative analysis. These interviews are never modified during the interview. You say it exactly the same way every time. They use Likert scales, yes, no, and multiple choice questions. This type of question aids in precision and saves time, but the answers can be, the answers can be checked off quickly and do not require transcription. Individuals who are doing a comparative case study, if there's anybody, that type of research needs some structure to assure cross-case compatibility, but a semi-structured interview might be preferable. So a semi-structured interview is the one I'm focusing on here. It follows a fairly specific template called an interview guide, and all the questions, all the main questions in the interview guide need to be asked. But the researcher has great flexibility, and you can vary the sequence of questions. You can skip a question if they already answered. You can skip prompts, or you can probe more deeply to elicit a richer, more detailed response. Questions may be more general than a survey too, but you still want to use consistent wording in a semi-structured interview. Personally, I believe the sequence of your questions should stay the same, because for a student, it's easy to get lost if you're moving around in the interview guide and trying to, pick something over here and pick something over there. Regardless of your reasons, it's really best if you can create a sequence that will work for you. And the sequence of questions is an important part of the interview design. You want the conversation to flow logically. So an unstructured interview may only require an outline of the general questions to be asked to initiate broader, deep conversations. Sub-questions can be identified in advance, or you might ask them spontaneously. So the unstructured interview is more like a conversation, but it can then be more complex to analyze later too, because you don't have all those guidelines. So here's a sample of an unstructured interview. Researchers sought to understand how homeless people could cope with the stigma associated with their situation. So they simply asked that question and let people answer in any way they chose for as long as they chose. That's a lot of data to analyze, especially in a student project. So there are a couple of additional types of interviews. I want to just describe these very briefly. Intensive interviews or in-depth interviews are a one-to-one approach. Rather than asking all respondents the same questions, you may form questions based on their participants' answers. This is similar to an unstructured interview, but provides more guidance to the participant. And a focused interview seeks the perspectives of persons exposed to a particular situation or event. Through content analysis, the researcher has determined hypotheses concerning the meaning and the effect of the situation, like after 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina in the US. Exploration with participants of their perspective on the meaning and effect of the situation will prove or disprove the hypothesis. So I'm going to go over group interviews a little bit, but this is just an overview and we're really not going to get into it, and I won't take questions on group interviews. Group interviews, like focus groups and Delphi panels, require more complex strategy than individual interviews. A focus group, for example, may take a long time to recruit and schedule people, a group of people all at the same time. Participants may need to speak in turn for the researcher to get clarity of content. Huge amounts of data may be difficult to transcribe and analyze for student researchers. Moderators may or may not be involved or may have limited involvement, and conferencing software may be used too. And I put this information in handout number 4. The Delphi panel is similar to a focus group in that it seeks consensus. A panel of experts is recruited who may have diverse perspectives to share. They need not meet or discuss the topic as a group. So the Delphi panel can be done via email or online. And I almost chose this approach, but then I decided on direct interviews instead. The process includes several rounds of questions and several rounds of analysis. So it is more complicated and more time consuming, possibly, maybe not, depending on your approach and how many your research questions, what your research questions are. So see handout number 4 for more information. So biographical interviews are perhaps the most complex of the fairly unstructured interviews. They may use documents, photos, and diaries. The design of the interview may be structured around these items to develop a narrative, yet the interviews are likely to be fairly unstructured otherwise. Multiple interviews may be conducted with as many individuals as necessary to illustrate, assemble, and reconstruct a life history. Developing a rapport is a priority, and you will probably have to interview participants more than once. A variety of contexts are reviewed, such as cultural setting, tradition, social factors, education, love, work, historical events of the period. So these can be really, really deep discussions. I put up a sample here of a biographical life history, the Esther M. Wilkins story, as told by her friends, was published by Dr. Pamela Brettschneider. She's actually was on my doctoral committee, and this was years of work. So it's probably not the best thing for a student research project. So the next section is about designing the questions themselves. So you may think these things are somewhat similar, but they're not. Each item below would be a separate question or topic or theme, and you need to differentiate between them when you set up your interview questions. They're not exactly the same, and they shouldn't be measured together. Values and beliefs and attitudes sound very similar, but they're really not. So you really need to define them clearly, and in fact, you may want to define them in your key terms. So the other thing you need to focus on is the types of answers you're seeking. You want to ask your questions in an appropriate format. And I've provided examples of this in handout number 5. So factual personal questions are those that seek factual information about an individual, like demographics, or how often they attend church or dine out. These are closed-ended questions. Factual questions about others are, for example, when you ask a head of household about other people in their family, such as their children's education or their spouse's education or income on a range like 10,000 to 20,000 or 21,000 to 30,000. These are closed-ended questions also. Factual informant questions are those that seek information about someone else's behavior or an organization. You're asking the individual about someone else's behavior. This may be partly open and partly closed questions. Attitude should not be confused with beliefs or values. Usually these are measured on Likert scales. Beliefs may be open-ended, true, false, agree to disagree, or disagree, yes, no questions. And values include normative standards or important principles or definitions. People can be asked to confirm their beliefs or attitudes, and it's usually open-ended, like how do you define culture? And then knowledge questions, those are true, false tests of knowledge. Did you know about this? Okay. So your interview may have 5 to 15 topics, and these should follow a logical sequence, and your questions follow logical sequence too. Not all types of questions shown here are needed. You don't have to do everything, and you choose what best answers your research questions. Unfortunately, there isn't time to go over every single one of these right now, so just see handout number 5 for examples. And I'm going to check the time. There is some time for questions. Let's see, Charles, let's see, a green question. Is there Likert scale or yes, no questions for semi-structured interviews? Likert scales and yes, no questions are used in mixed method interviews. So yes, they can be in semi-structured. I did a semi-structured mixed method interview. So yes, no questions, Likert scales are quantitative, and open-ended questions like how do you define your organizational, or how do you define organizational culture? That is an open-ended question, which is a qualitative response. So Likert scales and yes, no, those are quantitative questions. Great. Okay. So interview guide design. The first questions that you normally ask in an interview guide, at the top of your interview guide, actually you can highlight some of these things so you know to read aloud instructions or prompts to yourself throughout the guide, wherever it's helpful. Just to remind yourself, you might say, read aloud, is this a good time for you? Is it okay? And remind your participants, it's okay to withdraw anytime if you feel uncomfortable, or stop and continue later. So these 2 questions need to come at the very top of your interview guide. They're the first things that you ask. We'll go over the required documents a little later, but your initial invitation to participants will usually include advisory information regarding what to expect, like a 60-minute telephone interview. Now, at this point, it's helpful to remind the participants the number of sections in your interview guide. For example, we have 10 sections, about 40 questions total, and I expect the interview to take 60 minutes. This depends in part on how much you choose to share with me. Do you have any questions for me before we begin? So these 3 questions should be at the top of your interview guide. Okay, so advising them up front of this information prepares them for the time involved, and it gives you opportunities along the way to say how far you've come and how many sections are left to go. As the interview progresses, you can hear in their voice if they get impatient. So just let them know how many questions are left and ask if they'd like to finish up now or later. I've done 25 projects with dozens of interviews, and only one person actually asked me to continue later, and they scheduled right away, and they were really nice about it. Someone's asking me to repeat my response to Charles's question about whether Likert scales and yes/no questions are for semi-structured interviews. Yes, thank you, Charles. Yes/no questions and Likert scales are quantitative questions, and it doesn't really matter how your interview is structured so much as that whether you're doing a mixed method interview. So yes, you can use them in a semi-structured interview. Okay. You have quantitative and qualitative questions. And then you have a structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interview. Maybe that helps a little bit. So quantitative questions are usually in a structured interview. Semi-structured can include all kinds of questions, and unstructured usually only involves qualitative questions. So here are some types of questions. Demographics. Many studies benefit from some demographic information just to quantify the type of population you're working with. Don't ask for this information unless it's relevant to your research. Often these are just the first few questions that you ask in your interview guide, and some of these may have something to do with qualifying your participants, which we'll talk about a little more. Demographics are geographic information, gender preference, age range, education, professional background, as you can see, the title, years in their field, years at their current employer, something like that. Organizational background is talking about the company, how many employees there are, how many offices or facilities in what states or countries. Participant background, did you attend college online or on campus? Were you in New York on 9/11? Did you go to Mardi Gras? Did you go to Rio? So the rules of design, by now you've probably started to form your key research questions, and you've come up with gaps in the literature, and you want to work with those gaps. All of the questions in the interview guide will be aligned with your primary research questions, and you may have several major sub-questions. You might want to ask about a subject in different ways in different parts of the interview guide as well. This helps verify responses and improve your understanding of participant perspectives, experiences, or motivation. In my dissertation, I used 6 types of questions, and after my first pilot test, I realized I had to ask people for their definitions of 2 critical terms: how they defined organizational culture and how they defined organizational values. Without this, I didn't have a context for the prior responses regarding how they felt about their organization's culture and values. So that's the pilot test also gives you an opportunity to fine-tune. Asking questions in different ways in different parts of the interview guide will also really help you verify too if the response was really accurate to how someone feels about the topic. And I did find in some cases that questions were answered differently. So this, but being a student researcher, that's okay. You just have to say what happened and what you found. So what to avoid is also listed in detail in handout number 6. There are many more examples than this in the handout, but just quickly, avoid using negatives. Would you rather not use a non-medicated shampoo as a double negative? Do not rely too much on stretching people's memories. Do not overuse open-ended questions because it creates a lot of data for analysis and may allow respondents to go off on tangents, which lengthens the interview and can get you sidetracked. Do not overuse yes/no questions because the world is more nuanced than yes and no, except for possibly knowledge points. Quantitative questions like yes, no, and Likert scales can get very boring. So you don't want to overuse those. You'll get tired of saying them and they'll get tired of answering them. If you ask for qualifying remarks afterwards, it can be helpful in that context. Vignettes can bias responses if not worded very carefully, but your committee should also help you look for these issues. So, multiple choice. General rules for designing multiple choice questions is be very specific in your instructions step by step. Each sentence you read and each question should have only a single focus. So your instructions are very clear. Don't put two things at number one. Split it up into number 1 and 2. Forced choice questions may be better than check all that apply. And I put an example in the handout of this. Imagine you have a question like, what instruments have you studied in your life? And the choices you give are stringed instruments, keyboards, brass, beaten instruments, and vocal instrumentation. If you check all that apply, it may be harder to tally up and display this information statistically than in a yes/no forced choice question response to each separate type of instrument, meaning you ask the question, what instruments have you studied in your life? And then they have the choices, yes, no for stringed instruments, yes, no keyboards, yes, no brass. It's really easy to tally up all the responses like that. So again, look in handout number 6 and it will be more clear. Closed-ended questions must have the appropriate balanced options. This is a formula for the 5-point Likert scale, as I went over this earlier. So again, handout number 6 talks about the details, the advantages of each type of question and examples, and I'll provide a few more on the next slide, but I don't want to run out of time here. So question, can you go over the overarching questions versus sub-questions? To overarching question, the need for overarching questions. Overarching questions, what I meant by that is your main question. I think I had it on an earlier slide here, like how do you feel about your organization's culture? And or something like that. Anyway, so that's your main question. And then sub-questions are probing questions underneath, like how do you define culture? And do you think other employees in the organization feel the same way that you do? And so those are main questions and sub-questions. And your research questions too, your key research questions for your study can also have primary research questions and a couple of sub-questions that you want to answer as well. I hope that helps. So a few more issues on multiple choice questions. Choice range. Be sure to include all the possibilities in a range of choices, such as frequency. If you say, how many times did you exercise this week? And you give options for 1 through 7, it might not be sufficient if someone participates in more than one activity, like jogging in the morning and going to the gym after work. Specificity, provide explicit parameters for the answer choices. For example, how often do you go to the gym is vague as compared to how often do you go to the gym within a week. Uncommitted, should you include non-committal options like I don't know, I don't remember, neutral, none of the above, neither agree nor disagree, neither approve nor disapprove, I'd rather not say. Easy reading, ask only one question at a time. Format, in a written questionnaire, your response options should be either horizontal or vertical. This shortens the time it takes a participant to process this mentally. If you're looking at a list of answers this way, and then all of a sudden there's one this way, and then you switch back to this way, it takes a mental process, and just a little more time, and it's just more clean cut if you have the format consistent. So the next section is on recruiting tactics and documents, qualifying participants. So let's see here. So you can recruit people using various approaches. Researcher-driven recruiting with organizational support using flyers, emails, letters, and follow-up calls to solicit interest and participation. Spontaneous recruitment occurs through word of mouth or when an observer joins an active group discussion. Key informant recruitment involves stakeholder or organizational leadership smoothing the path. For example, if you contact a national or local organization, such as the Society for Human Resources, when you want to talk to HR managers, a chapter leader may give you permission to contact their membership and may even send off an introduction and invitation on your behalf, even if you didn't ask for it. Members then may refer you to other members too. You might conduct an online search for people with specific titles or in a professional association. For example, the State Water Board may publish a list of its members, and you can maybe find contact information for them. Recruiting internal members from a group or population will usually involve emails, letters, and phone calls. So the next thing to consider is your outreach plan. First, you want to develop a pool of potential interviewees, which doesn't mean you talk to anybody, which you can't do until you have all your approvals from your university. You can't talk to anybody, but you can identify the groups you plan to contact or the individuals. Create a spreadsheet where you list all your potential interviewees and leave room for contact information and the dates of your contact attempts. Plan to email, then call twice if needed. I usually email twice, track the dates, allow 2 to 3 days between attempts. A secretary or assistant, if you found that information, they might be able to get you through to your contact if you don't get a direct response. If you have a budget for mailing out a questionnaire, do you plan to follow up? And if so, how? You have to think about your budget when you're doing things that way. So invitation to participate is one of the first documents you'll design other than your interview guide, after your interview guide. Your university may have a template for the invitation to participants and the informed consent form. And approval that's required again before you send anything to anyone. So I've included specific details regarding these 6 sections in handout number 7 to save time during this webinar. But I wanted to tell you, this is handout number 7, yeah. I wanted to tell you how I found study participants. My study required participants to have at least 5 years of experience as an HR manager, to have a college degree, and to have worked formally to mentor others in their careers or manage company internships. I knew about the Society for Human Resource Management, but they only allowed access to their membership for a fee, a pretty stiff fee. So I looked at their suggestion, actually. I looked over their local member chapter websites, and several chapters stated that the group engaged in mentoring or had formal mentoring programs. So I started by contacting chapters on the West Coast to be in the same time zone as me. And one chapter out of a half dozen that I contacted agreed to join my study. The chapter president gave me permission to recruit members via email, and I was able to get my 12 participants and even a few extra in case someone dropped out. I ended up with 15 interviews, which took 6 weeks to schedule and complete, primarily due to my work schedule and my participants' work schedules. So they do take a while to get through. And in the meantime, I just focused on editing my paper. So no time was lost. Qualifying participants. As mentioned earlier, a few of the 3 to 4 questions that are asked first in the recruiting process are to qualify your participants. As I mentioned, I had required a college degree, 5 years of experience, etc. So what criteria are essential for your participants to be credible? If someone isn't qualified, you can always say, I'm so sorry, we were looking for participants with at least 10 years of experience. Do you mind being a backup participant in case we need more insight? Or I'm really sorry, but maybe I can call you again in 3 years when you've got more experience on this topic, or something like that. Or you could even ask for a referral. So consider all these questions, and there are a lot more on handout number 7. Be sure to track information. If you find someone is not qualified, keep track of that as well. Incentive to participate. Most adults like to participate in research because we're not often asked what we think, and we really would like to be able to share our experiences or our opinions. You might want to encourage participation, however, to busy professionals especially, by promising a reward. They may look forward to finding out how their response is compared to everyone else in your study. Some key information like this can be provided in a highlights report. If appropriate and approved by your committee, you can offer to share key findings after your analysis of the data is approved. A highlights report is usually just 1 or 2 pages, delivered with a thank you note at the very end after all your data is analyzed and your chapter on data analysis is approved by your chair or your committee. Then you send them the report with a thank you note, and this offer to provide the report might also enhance your credibility and facilitate the recruiting process. So, informed consent. Once someone agrees to participate and you've asked the qualifying questions, then you need their signature on an informed consent form. Again, your university probably has a template for this. You can use DocuSign for this or accept a PDF signature. This is up to your university guidelines or your committee or supervisor. Remember that personal identity is confidential, and you must describe how this information is protected and how it is stored, and for 3 to 5 years or however long your university requires you to store this information. So the closure. On your closure to the invitation to participate, you remind them that you will send a highlights report illustrating key findings as soon as it's available and approved. That's the language you can use. You confirm their email address, and if you have heard from all of your contacts but you haven't got enough participants, you may want to ask them for a referral. But you need to remember that referrals can be biased. This is okay if you describe the potential for bias in your paper. For example, internal referrals to your study from a group leader or another group member. They know they'll probably talk to each other about it later, so this creates what's called social desirability bias. It's being encouraged by someone they know to participate in your study. Members who are encouraged to participate when they don't really want to may not be authentic. I had someone like that in my dissertation research, and you are aware of the bias and you need to discuss it in your paper, just that this person, you know, you feel this person may have been coerced into participating. This should not be a deterrent to interviewing anyone, but if you recognize these factors, then discuss them. And I think this is described in handout number 3. At the end, of course, don't forget to say thank you. So I don't see any more questions right now, and we just have a couple more slides to go. So I'll keep going. The next section is on approvals and the pilot test. This is what we mentioned earlier. You have a number of official approvals. Be sure to perfect your spelling, grammar, and APA in your documents prior to seeking approval from your chair or supervisor or the committee. For people who know APA, these things jump out and really distract them from reading your work. Do you need approval from an ethical review board, institutional review board, or an ethics committee? There will be probably a long form that you will fill out and check off information to let them know of what your study is about, and they will then either exempt you from oversight or require oversight. It partly depends on the subjects you're working with, the human subjects you're working with. If you are not doing interventions or experiments, if you're not working with minors, then you probably will get pretty quick approval from the IRD. All the documents directed to study participants require approval, and this includes your interview guide, your letter of invitation to participants, the greeting. This is where I was talking about if you're approaching a group to recruit members and the group leader offers to send out an introductory note, you should probably write this yourself. Something they can use, which they may not, but you should offer at least. Background research. Documents of 1 to 2 pages attached to your invitation describe your study's objective and the rationale for choosing your sample population. You're just telling them, I chose you guys because you are experts in this, and your opinions or experiences or perspectives will provide inestimable value to my research, and I'm really grateful that you've chosen to participate. Then you describe the objectives of the research, and you include a sample reference list, make it very formal, appropriate APA, etc., a background document. This helps encourage participation by telling them why you think they're experts, why their opinion would be valuable, the purpose of the study, and it looks very formal and credible. And then you have the informed consent form. There's a question from Namita. Is there a length of interview, especially using Likert scales, that could affect the quality of responses? Interview length, if you're using Likert scales, it's a questionnaire, and people can get really bored with a lot of those. And so, yeah, that can affect the quality of responses. If they're not really asked there to speak to you in terms of an interview, and they're just saying yes, no, agree, neutral, blah, 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 it gets boring. The length of the interview itself, it depends on the person. You should test your interview on a friend, read through it yourself, time it. Like this webinar, we're getting on an hour here now, and I still got one more slide to go. Sometimes people will talk longer. I had one person talk for nearly 2 hours, and he just was enthusiastic. And other people completed my interview in about 40 minutes. So it just really depends. But you should try and make it an approachable length of time. Usually, 30, 40 minutes is about reasonable to ask someone to set aside. Maybe 20 minutes. I've seen them in the professional market research that I've done. Sometimes they say 20 minutes, but it always takes longer. Regarding hard to gain approval groups, students with disabilities, tips about gaining or for the best way to go about gaining approval for confidential data working with the students with disabilities. Tips for gaining approval. I'm going to have to come back to that. I want to finish pilot tests first, but I think if you really work with your chair and your committee about why you chose this sample population and what you want to do with this sample population, what you want to ask of them, or how you're engaging with them, then approval isn't necessarily harder to get as much as it's, you have to justify it really well. So look for studies that other students have done where they've worked with this population and see how they justify their choice, and just read their studies and see how they approached it. They should include everything in there, the interview guide. It may even include their ethical review committee documents, and discuss it in detail with your chair and your committee to make sure that you can get, that you have justified access as best as you can. Okay, I want to go over pilot test questions real quick. So you will need to ask your first scheduled participant if they mind being part of a pilot test. You tell them, I wanted to ask you this up front because the pilot test includes several extra questions at the end, so it will take longer. If they don't want to do that, then you may need to reschedule that person after you get someone scheduled who will do a pilot test. So pilot questions are added at the end. And I had 9 questions, which are shown in handout number 7. Your choice of questions for the pilot must be justified. I got them from somewhere else. I don't remember if it was Bryman. Your chair will review the results of the pilot and then advise you if you need to do another one to fine tune again. I did 2 of them. My first person gave me some responses, so I modified my questionnaire or my interview guide, and my second one went by without a hitch. They said, no, these are the kinds of questions you can ask. Was the interview too long? In any particular question, was the response you would have given unavailable? Are any questions irrelevant in your view? And I've put a list of these types of questions in handout number 7, so you can see what they are. And I asked all of them. And the first time I got some responses, and the second time I didn't. The person said it was fine. So handout number 7 includes a list of potential questions, sample paragraphs demonstrating how you might justify using those questions, and a checklist to use when designing a qualitative interview guide, which is from my Bryman book. Here it is again. That's what it looks like. There. And that is pretty much it. These are the 2 charts. Oh no, I didn't give you those charts. I gave you those charts in number 7. Okay, never mind. I have them in my PowerPoint. Okay, so it is now been an hour, and I don't know if Alana will allow us to go over and take any extra questions. Again, if you have complex questions, my email is up there, and that will be me.
Of course, you can go over. If people want to ask questions and you don't mind hanging out, of course, more than welcome to do so. But I think we need to be able to say goodbye to the people who only had an hour and they've been here the full time. You fabulous, Stephanie. Really good, excellent handouts. I'm sure everybody in the room got a lot out of this. And you have your email address here. They can come back to you with questions. But go ahead, take as long as you want, and then just when you're done, go to the recording tab, close off the recording, and end the webinar. Are you comfortable doing that?
I'll find it.
Good. Very good. All right. Take care, everybody. And excellent, excellent, Stephanie. See you later.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Jamie, I'm so glad this helped you. You're very welcome. Rintaro, thank you too. Alana was going to send the slides, and she's already checked out. I will remind her to send the slides. Hannah, thank you so much. Again, I think Alana was supposed to send the slides. I don't actually do the uploads. She takes care of that, so I will remind her to send the slides. And you'll also get the recording. I'm glad it was so helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Makes me feel really good. It's only my second time doing a webinar. Disability approval question. Yes, again, I don't have experience personally with getting permission to work with students with disabilities. Permission to work with any group is, you have to justify the fact that you know, the reasons why this group is important to answering your research questions. I mean, I don't know what your paper is, but it sounds to me, TM, that you need to work with students with disabilities or the disabled populations in order to answer your research questions. So you will need to look at other studies that have been done by other students working with disabled populations, see how they justified working with those populations. use their actual language, cite the language that they used in their study. And you may say that so-and-so from such and such university in 2017 worked with disabled populations and justified their approach by saying blah, blah, blah. And then you cite it, so you have actual credible sources, published in ProQuest. And also you may look at, actual studies conducted by other people, National Institute of Health maybe. Again, I don't know your topic, but you have to just really justify it really well and work with your chair and your committee on it. They will tell you, yes, we think this will get past the IRB, and or they may ask you to, look a little further to justify access to those populations. Hannah would love to learn more about data analysis process next time. I will see about doing that. I'll ask Alana. Yes, Janice, there is a lot. I could not possibly get it all into an hour, but the handout has even more information too, a little more information. Jamie, doing a social media analysis for my research project, wondering if you had any insight on how to collect and organize data from posts and tweets. Should I let the data guide me before I make my own categories to limit bias? I haven't done social media analysis. How to collect and organize data? Well, I think it depends on if you want to do, you're doing qualitative analysis on the content. That's what I mentioned. There's, you can use coding, or you can use statistical modeling to come up with narrative themes, or you can do it interpretively yourself with regard to the content. And yeah, the data guides you to determine categories for analysis, definitely. The data is what guides you into creating those themes and describing them, the themes that appear. So that's exactly how you would do it. I hope that helps. I don't know, Hannah, I don't know how to do qualitative coding. It's in my book, but I didn't do it. So I would actually have to just read it and tell you what the book said. So that's what I would suggest that you do as well. Just, I did not do coding. It seemed a very complex way, but I have seen people do it. I've actually seen people use software to do it, and it comes out pretty spectacular too. So I would recommend, if you're interested, just to study up on how to do that, and then make a decision about whether you think that's a good approach for your project. Hannah, okay, well, TM, STEM students with disabilities and student engagement. I would say TM regarding STEM students, your university might be more likely to approve your project if it involves students elsewhere rather than in your own school, possibly. They may or may not want their own students participating in the projects, in student projects like that. You could also consider possibly students who have graduated and can, a year ago maybe, and can reflect on their experience, and that may give you a little more freedom with your committee. Quick question from Hannah. How do we define and come up with our unit of analysis? Is unit of analysis the group we're studying? I have to look up that term, unit of analysis. Let's see. So, major entity that you're analyzing in your study, individuals, okay. Individuals, groups, artifacts, books, photos, newspapers, units of analysis. So, yes, apparently it is the group that you are studying. Jamie, R software for coding. Great suggestion. I haven't heard of that one because I didn't do coding. Great, thank you. Hannah, sorry I missed it. Can you share how you analyze your qualitative data in your own research? I did a couple of types of analysis. First, I had a person who is a vice president of methodology at a market research firm in Toronto, Canada, who was a colleague of mine where I worked. And he had access to the software and offered to help by generating these statistical models. And then he taught me how to analyze the results of those statistical models. So that was one thing. I could not do it on my own, absolutely. And I didn't plan to. It was great that he offered. What I planned to do and what I did myself was I had organized my questions into themes, and asking about an individual background or individual impressions on this or that, or organizational background, the themes from my all the questions I was answering. And then I looked for similarities and differences in responses. I divided my response group into groups. I had 3 groups. So these people seemed to really lean towards favoring what I had proposed. These people were really against what I had proposed, and these people were more had more moderate opinions. So just look for ways to divide up your information into people who thought this way or that way, or versus that way, and consensus. In answering these 5 questions, which kind of had to do with organizational culture, there was a lot of people agreed that there was this, and that it could mentor doctoral students in a career pipeline. Whereas in group 3, they really thought it would be impossible because it'd be too much time on the part of the managers, and it would take way too much from the day-to-day work or something like that. So you look at the actual values that you get and then arrange it into groups in that context. I heard recording. Tam, yes, you will have access to the recording. She sends an email that gives you a link so you can hear the recording again anytime. And they send you, DoctoralNet sends you copies of the slides as well as the handout, which is already up on there. Final follow-up question, is your study mixed methods? If so, do you use multiple regression models or HLM for the quantitative part? Hannah, again, my study was mixed methods, yes, but I would actually have to go look and tell you the language of what it was those statistical models were. I am not highly skilled in quantitative analysis, so I had to be taught and coached, which of course I stated in my paper that I had an expert advising me. So I can look that up if you want to email me exactly what time. It was very cool and very exciting to learn about, but I'm not an expert enough to repeat what I did without looking it up. Okay, is that it? Okay, then I'm going to see if I can figure out how to stop the recording and say bon voyage to everyone. How do I stop the recording? Audio or exit webinar. Oops. I may not have access to stopping the recording. Oh well. guess I can hit end it. This is going to kick everyone out. So any more questions? It says it will kick you out if I end the webinar. Okay, bye-bye.